Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to the Temple Institute Parsha class. My name is Gedalia Meyer, and I'm podcasting from Malu Dumim in Israel. Revenge is sweet. That much is agreed upon by everyone. There is nothing quite like the feeling of true revenge. It accomplishes a few things at once. First and foremost, it is a form of justice that doesn't necessarily require the laborious and unreliable process of going through the courts. Second, it creates a kosher channel for rage that would normally be labeled irrational or evil. It is a perfect manifestation of righteous anger. Third, it just hits a spot in a way that no other feeling quite does. It is a form of satisfaction that somehow makes us feel whole again, that a burden has been lifted from our shoulders. It gives us the undefinable fulfillment of closure. This is all quite amazing when we consider that most of us would probably see revenge as a somewhat crude reaction to dealing with the problem with another person. It is the type of thing gangs do to each other, or perhaps warring tribes. It is a form of street justice, not something that civilized people should be involved with. Its emotional fulfillment is real, but it is also quite disturbing. Is this really the way we are or wish to be? Do we really want to consider ourselves motivated by something as self-centered as getting even? Isn't that a bit childish or even primitive? Nobody really wants to ask these questions because they are too threatening to the basic desire for vengeance. Revenge is simply a natural human drive, no different than love or pride. It is there somewhere in the mind, and there is no reason to be ashamed of it. It is about as universal a feeling as there is. As far as we can tell, it has always been there. There's no reason to think that people living in the caves were not also driven by powerful feelings of vengeance when the mood and situation moved them. For that matter, there is no reason to believe that it isn't a feeling that manifests in many higher forms of animals, such as chimpanzees and apes. Perhaps whales and dolphins possess some elements of revenge in their mental abilities. So is revenge something that is good or bad? Nobody really has a straight answer to this question. It is a little of both. When we see somebody else completely taken over by the feeling of needing revenge, we sense that there is something wrong, something evil in the works. But when that same feeling possesses us, we have no such qualms. We usually have no wish to fight the feeling or to suppress its power into the recesses of the mind. We know that such an effort will probably fail, and even if it succeeds to some degree, there will always be lingering tinges of regret or guilt. It is quite difficult to completely eradicate a strong desire for revenge. It requires the spiritual stamina of a saint and the willpower of a superhero. Thankfully, most of the time, that feeling accomplishes nothing in actuality. The feeling is there, but we are usually powerless to do anything about it. We may go through the effort of getting actual revenge, but more often than not, it just doesn't work. Something goes wrong and the other person gets away with whatever they did. Either that or we don't have the guts to carry through on our secret scheme of vengeance. Perhaps it's better this way. We get to keep the satisfying feeling simmering within us, dreaming of the great day when it will actually reach fulfillment, but never really getting there. This way, we don't have to regret our rash actions at some future date. It may come as a surprise that the Torah explicitly prohibits revenge. It is about as explicit as it gets in the Torah for a prohibition. Quote, do not take revenge. Do not bear a grudge against your people. Love your neighbor as yourself. I am Hashem. The Torah prohibits this very natural desire in a few words. What is truly surprising about this is that we find incidents of vengeance all over the Torah. It is one of the more common emotions and motivations described in the Bible. It probably comes up more often in one way or another than love. In fact, in this week's Parsha, there is an explicit command for revenge. The Parsha is another double Parsha, made up of one called Matot and another called Masei. The first means tribes, and it really has nothing to do with either the subject that it introduces or with the Parsha as a whole. It is simply the first significant word in the first verse of the Parsha. The second, Masei, means journeys. It happens that this word pretty much defines much of the Parsha. This is the Parsha that describes the journeys of the Israelites from Egypt all the way to the cusp of entering the Holy Land. There is much more to the Parsha than this, but it serves as a symbolic term for the very geographic subject matter of most of it. The first Parsha, Matot, begins with a brief section about the making, fulfilling, or nullifying of vows. Following this is the section that involves revenge. This section is introduced by Moshe telling everyone, quote, "Take revenge for the Israelites on the Midianites." This phrase actually uses the word for revenge twice. It's not at all clear how this explicit command works with the equally explicit command mentioned earlier that prohibits revenge. In any case, revenge is taken against the Midianites, and there is massive killing and plundering in the classical style of the Bible. The parsha ends with a long section dealing with the request of two tribes to possess their portions of inheritance of the land on the eastern side of the Jordan River. The Israelites had already conquered much of the land on the eastern side of the river, including what is now the Golan Heights. This request was simply a matter of these tribes wanting to stay there and settle the land that had already been conquered. Instead of readily acquiescing to this request, Moshe accuses them of essentially being traitors to the great cause of conquering the land of Canaan. Not only would they not assist in the military efforts, but they would discourage everyone else from risking their lives when they could just as easily set up shop on the eastern side of the river. In the end, a compromise is worked out in which the men of those tribes would fight at the front of the army and only return to their new homes when the wars were over. The second Parashat Matot-Masei lists all the journeys through the wilderness. Following this is the only real geographic description of the land of Israel in the Bible. Like the locations on the journeys, the individual places mentioned as borders are not always very clear. But for better or worse, this is the best idea we ever get as to the actual borders of ancient Israel. It comprises most of what is modern Israel and a small but significant portion of what is now Lebanon. The individual tribal borders within the land are not given in this parsha. They would have to wait until the actual conquering of the land in the book of Joshua. But the final section of the parsha does deal with an issue that was bound to come up. This was the situation where a woman who inherited ancestral land from her father's estate would marry into a family from another tribe, and her land would then become part of that tribe through the laws of inheritance. This was seen as a glaring social problem, since the tribal inheritances were supposed to be perpetual. The resolution of this problem was that each woman should only marry within her tribe. This way, the problem never actually happens. Of course, this seems to kick the problem down the road, since intertribal marriage was not actually prohibited. But at least the problem was solved on a temporary basis. Right before that final section is another rather long section dealing with the so-called cities of refuge. These were cities scattered throughout the land, which served as a place where those who killed another person in some accidental manner could flee. The assumption was that the family of the victim would want to take vengeance on the killer, even though it was clear that the killing was inadvertent. This is a classic example of the power of vengeance. Even though this whole thing was an accident, the human mind simply doesn't work that way. It needs vengeance. The person who takes this vengeance is called the Goel Hadam, the blood avenger. The cities of refuge were places in which that accidental killer could live the rest of their life without fear of being avenged by that blood avenger. As long as the killer remained in the city of refuge, the blood avenger could do nothing. They were not even permitted to enter the city of refuge. But if the killer ventured outside of the borders of the city, all bets were off. It was a refuge for the accidental killer, but only as long as he or she chose to remain within the limits of the city. There is one odd detail about this arrangement that frequently strikes those who notice it as seeming somewhat arbitrary. This detail is that there is actually a kind of time limit to how long the killer must remain in the city of refuge. It turns out there's a certain point in which the killer can leave and not fear vengeance from the blood avenger. The Torah states that this endpoint is the death of the high priest, or Kohen HaGadol. This odd detail is expressed in a single verse, and it seems to come out of nowhere. It is completely unexpected, and no reason is given for its rationale. Within Judaism, a popular explanation is that the Kohen HaGadol was in some way partially responsible for this accidental killing having taken place to begin with. He should have prayed that such things didn't happen within the society that he had so much influence over. Because of this, his death is looked upon as a kind of atonement for the sin of the accidental killing. When he dies, the killer is no longer guilty. Well, this does seem a bit arbitrary, as there is no fixed time period for when this atonement actually happens. It is the rule in the Torah. Perhaps there is a rational explanation for this rule. It all boils down to revenge. Revenge is natural, as confirmed by both the Torah and by human nature. But it is also a somewhat primitive desire, and it is prohibited by the Torah. Yet the blood avenger is permitted to take revenge under the right circumstances. Perhaps this apparently arbitrary rule involving the death of the Kohen HaGadol is a way to place a limit on the human desire for revenge. It is acceptable up to a certain point, and then it is no longer acceptable. We are permitted feelings that are natural to the mind. We are even permitted to transform those feelings into action when it is deemed reasonable and constructive in some way. But when it comes to something like vengeance, there is a limit. Vengeance is allowed and perhaps even encouraged, but it is not something that should be allowed to boil and fester forever. We are all required to eventually get control of ourselves and master even the very human need for revenge. If it takes a traumatic national event like the death of the Kohen HaGadol to bring things to a close, so be it. Revenge is sweet, but eventually it turns to bitterness. At some point, it has to be submersed. Shabbat Shalom.